We have two parts to the reading today. So our first part of the reading is Acts 16, verse 1 to 5. Paul came first to Derbe, then Lystra. He found a disciple there by the name of Timothy, son of a devout Jewish mother and Greek father. Friends in Lystra and Iconium all said what a fine young man he was. Paul wanted to recruit him for their mission, but first took him aside and circumcised him, so that he wouldn't offend the Jews who lived in those parts. They all knew that his father was Greek. As they travelled from town to town, they presented the simple guidelines that Jerusalem apostles and leaders had come up with. That turned out to be most helpful. Day after day, the congregations became stronger in faith and larger in size. And the next part goes from verse 11 to 15. Putting out from the harbour at Troas, we made straight run for Samothrace. The next day we tied up at New City and walked from there to Philippi, the main city in that part of Macedonia, and, even more importantly, a Roman colony. We lingered there for several days. On the Sabbath we left the city and went down along the river, where we had heard that there was to be a prayer meeting. We took our place with the women who had gathered there and talked with them. One woman, Lydia, was from Thyatira and a dealer in expensive textiles, known to be a God-fearing woman. As she listened with intensity to what was being said, the master gave her a trusting heart, and she believed.
Are you curious to know what's in the middle bit that we missed out? You'll have to go read it yourself, because I'm not going to tell you. I'm Denise, for those of you who don't know me, and I would like to welcome you here as well. We've got some people who have been here for such a long time, and some people who have been here not long at all. So we're going to have supper in the courtyard after the service, before anybody who wants to heads off with Hendrika to the foodie group. And there she is there. So if you need any more details, go find Hendrika over supper. Yeah, so we've been going through Acts. We've been journeying, because Acts is all about journeys. And I think some of you were thinking, we're never going to get to the end of Acts. Denise is 6 chapters behind where we're supposed to be up to. I'm going to do a little slingshot tonight and catch us up a little. So if you've been here for a while, you'll know that Acts started in Jerusalem with the risen Jesus telling his followers that he was going to send his Spirit and that she would empower them to be Jesus' witnesses. Witnesses to who Jesus was. Witnesses to his resurrection life. Witnesses to this new world, this new creation that Jesus ruled over as king. And he told his followers that this witness was going to start in Jerusalem, move out to Judea and Samaria, and then to the uttermost parts of the earth. And that's kind of formed the basis of the whole story of Acts, is that one verse about Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and then the uttermost parts of the earth. And we've traced that early movement since we've started this journey. We remember the Spirit coming at Pentecost in Jerusalem and the disciples' heads catching on fire. Remember that? But not burning up, just like the burning bush that Moses saw in the sacred place where God met with him. Showing that God doesn't meet with people in buildings made of stone, but dwells in people by God's Spirit. And then just as Jesus was led by the Spirit in the way that he journeyed through his life, so we're called to follow Jesus on our journey through life, becoming people who are attentive to the movement of the Spirit and willing to walk the same road that Jesus did, even when it gets really hard. And it does get really hard, doesn't it? And we saw how the early Christian movement in Luke's story was a really generous one. They met together, they ate together, they helped each other out when there was a need. There was this community formed where wealth or status don't buy influence. Kind of refreshing. Remember that weird story of Ananias and Sapphira? In Jerusalem, the early church became this community of grace, where anyone is welcome, but also one where there's this expectation of costly commitment to each other. So there's this vision cast in Acts of what a community could look like if it followed the road that Jesus walked. And Luke also told us a story of a community that faced internal conflict, where one cultural group complained that it was getting overlooked and not being treated fairly. And the response to that was that the whole community came together and came up with a creative solution to the problem. Because people who follow Jesus are flawed, still flawed. They're flawed human beings, and they have relationship issues with each other. And problems and conflicts, they don't necessarily mean a church is spiritually immature or has gone off the rails. It might mean that a church is healthy and growing, and with new people and more diversity and people from different backgrounds worshipping together and more interpersonal relationships comes a lot of complexity. And how churches deal with problems says more about the church than maybe what those problems even are. So all of this happened in Jerusalem, and the church seemed like maybe it'd just stay there forever. But one of the people in that multicultural church found himself on the wrong side of a bunch of religious leaders, and they conspired against him so that he was stoned, and I'm not talking about drugs or alcohol, but actual stones being thrown at him until he was dead. And so this great persecution broke out against the church, and they fled out of Jerusalem and into Judea and Samaria, just as Jesus said they would. And they started witnessing to Jesus and his new way of being and living. And then they started witnessing to people that they came across there in Judea and Samaria. And so somehow what Jesus said would happen did actually happen, even though it was really unexpected and not planned, and it was actually quite distressing in how it happened. Life is mysterious. And in the meantime, Jesus, one of Jesus' most dedicated followers, had his long-held beliefs overturned when God orchestrated this whole bizarre series of events to convince him that God's vision for who could belong to his people was a much bigger one than what he'd thought, much bigger than just one racial group. And the whole movement, it was going global, it was going viral, and no one, not even Peter, got to stand at the door and decide who was allowed in and who wasn't. And then there's this other guy by the name of Paul, who was the least likely to ever join this movement because he thought he was doing what God wanted by dragging Jesus' followers out of their homes and throwing them in prison. But he gets stopped in his tracks by Jesus in a blinding light and this divine appointment, and he ends up doing a complete about-face, and suddenly, instead of throwing Jesus' followers in prison, Paul's getting thrown in prison. Why? Well, because having met the risen Jesus, Paul is the one now witnessing to Jesus and taking the message of Jesus to the uttermost parts of the earth. And here we are. That, in case you weren't here for the last few months, is where we've come. And so now from Acts chapter 13 all the way to chapter 20, Paul travels around taking his message about this new Jesus movement, this way of Jesus, with its promise of forgiveness and its impact of turning things upside down. And he starts close to home, but he travels further and further, and eventually he takes Jesus' message into Europe, the uttermost parts of the earth. And in chapter 13 to 20, we meet a whole bunch of people that Paul met who had their lives turned around, turned upside down by the message of Jesus that he told them. And you heard a little bit about a couple of them when in Sophie's reading. In Cyprus, he meets this guy, proconsul Sergius Paulus. He's a Roman magistrate. He governed a whole region. We're told he's an intelligent man. He's an educated man. He's an elite. He's astounded by Paul's message. In Lystra, Paul meets a man who was disabled. He's been unable to walk since birth. And he was listening intently to Paul's message, and somehow he just knew that it was all true. And Paul sees his faith, and Jesus heals the man through Paul. And later in Lystra, Paul and his friend Silas meet this young man called Timothy. His mother was Jewish, and his father was Greek. Timothy is the child of an interracial couple. In Philippi, Paul and Silas meet a group of women who are gathered for prayer outside the city gates, which is kind of an unusual place to be gathered for prayer. We're not quite sure why they were outside the city gates. Well, one of them is Lydia, this woman who sold purple cloth. And you know, purple, only wealthy people, only elite people buy purple cloth. It's very expensive. Someone who sold purple cloth is probably wealthy. And she seems to be the head of her household. There's no man in the picture. This is also very unusual. So she's probably a widow, or maybe she's divorced and from a wealthy family. And she's the head of her household. So she has all of these slaves and perhaps extended family who live in her household, and she's kind of the overarching person in that. And she finds out about Jesus from Paul, and she says, look, if you think that I'm worthy of being a follower, come and stay in my household. In the same town, there's a slave girl who's possessed by a spirit, and this spirit could foretell the future. See, this girl, she's become a business asset because her owners make money from her prophecies. And Paul drives this spirit out of her, and suddenly the owner's business is destroyed, and they're not happy. And the owner sees Paul and Silas and has them thrown in prison. And there they meet a jailer, probably rough as guts, I would say. I would think a jailer in a prison like this is probably a thug. He's got to keep the whole prison population under control. There's an earthquake, some miraculous intervention by God, and all the doors fly open and the chains fall off all of the prisoners' feet, not just Paul and Silas, but the rest of the prison population as well. But instead of fleeing, they stay because they know that the jailer will be executed if his prisoners escape. And so Paul and Silas create salvation for the Philippian jailer. Who is it who's in prison? I'm not sure. All these people, so many people, we get little stories of all these different people, and they all become part of this Jesus movement. And they and people like them start meeting in homes all over the empire. And it's like no other meeting. There are women, slaves, Gentiles, there are educated elite, there are thugs, the disabled. They cross every boundary, gender, social, racial. The uttermost parts of the earth isn't just a geographical term. The uttermost parts of the earth is also every conceivable person. This new movement is breaking down ethnic boundaries. It's breaking cultural modes. It breaks out of its Jewish birthplace where it began in Jerusalem, and it starts spilling out onto other cultures and other ethnicities too. And then it starts breaking those moulds as well, almost as if it's bigger than any particular culture. It's bigger than any one ethnicity. No one people, no one group can contain it, because this thing, it can't be tamed, it can't be domesticated. And it's also bursting out of social and economic moulds as well. It's breaking down walls between the very small elite ruling class, it was very small in the empire, and everybody else. And once you start breaking down the barriers between different cultures, different ethnicities, different social economic classes, well, you're just left with, like, people. You're just left with people. people who don't fit really into these nice, neat categories. You're just left with human beings. They've got differences, of course. People still have their cultures. Some eat kosher, some don't. People still have different skin colours. They have different accents. They speak different languages, different vocations. Some are still wealthier than others. But in this Jesus movement, none of that matters. These things, they don't divide people anymore. They don't wall people off from each other. Instead of being bonded together by their social class or their culture or their religious beliefs, what binds them together is Jesus. This new and very different king that asks them for their allegiance and asks them to imitate him and the way that he lived, to take on his values. So allegiance to Jesus means walking the way of Jesus. And this early Christian movement, that's what they were called, the way. It's a way of living in the world. It's a way of navigating through life, a way of living with your neighbours. It's a way of seeing that there's no them and us. Everybody sits around a table together. They eat and drink together. And they do it in a world where status is everything. But the Jesus movement is profoundly different. Slaves and masters sitting side by side at the same table, equal in status. Jew and Gentile eating together, no clean or unclean, because what God has declared clean must not be called unclean. Women and men with no hierarchical barriers separating them. And that's the reason why we call this table an open communion. It's an open table. Anyone is welcome to join us in remembering Jesus and honouring this way of being that he taught. There's no us and there's no them. All of us sit around this table that doesn't belong to any one person. It doesn't belong to any culture. It doesn't belong to any group. It's Christ's table, and Christ is the one who sends out the guest list. And you're on it. And the only one who can stop you from sitting at the table is you. So the bread represents Jesus' body, broken body. And the cup represents his shed blood. The bread is gluten-free. The juice is non-alcoholic. It's another way of showing that everyone is welcome and everyone is included. And it doesn't matter if you're a long-term member or whether you're here for the first time. If you would like to join us in remembering Jesus' love for us, you can. So there's a table on each side, and as the music plays, should have given you a bit more of a heads up there, Shane. In your own time, go grab a piece of gluten-free cracker or a cup of juice and come back to your seat so that we can eat and drink together. So that Paul, that man who dragged Jesus' followers out of their homes and threw them in prison, this is what he said. He said, "For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night in which he was betrayed," I wonder if those words hurt when he said them. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took bread, and after he'd given thanks, he broke it, and he said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Let's eat together. And in the same way, he also took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this every time you drink it in remembrance of me." Let's drink together. It became this movement which is still, to this day, the most culturally, ethnically diverse religious movement in human history. But do you know, when the way of Jesus gets too closely identified with one particular culture, or one particular national identity, or one particular set of political beliefs, it ceases to become the way of Jesus. Because as we've seen through our little tour through Acts today, the way of Jesus is the breaking down of barriers, not the building up of them. Its power comes from binding us together as human beings, not as Aussies and Africans, right wing and left wing, gay, straight, cis, trans, male and female, different tax brackets, different educational qualifications, different vocations. Our faith, our walking the way of Jesus, means breaking down barriers, not building them up. Or as Pope Francis once famously said, a person who thinks only about building walls and not building bridges is not Christian. I think that Jesus and Paul and Pope Francis were onto something. Because the world works better when people are thinking more about how to build bridges and less about how to build walls. But you know, that's so easy to say from up here. I can just talk about this all day long. But gee, it's really hard to put into practice. So I'm going to leave you with a whole bunch of hard questions. And I don't have any more answers to these questions than you do. But I want to end with a fire hose full of questions, precisely because this way of Jesus is meant to change the way that we think about things. What would a world of less barriers look like? You know, pragmatically. Would it mean no passports? You know, anybody can come and go freely from country to country? What would that mean for biosecurity, for human trafficking? What would it look like in Iran, Israel, Gaza, Lebanon? What would it look like to get rid of barriers? What would it look like in a pandemic? What would it mean for global migration, for multinational companies looking for tax havens? Building more bridges and less walls is really not an easy thing to do. And we would be naive to think it is. What would Australia look like? What would Queensland look like with less walls and more bridges? Although, arguably, Brisbane probably doesn't need any more bridges anytime soon. What would less barriers mean for our taxation system? For our social security system? What would it mean for international student numbers? For the way that we welcome asylum seekers? For processes of managing asylum seekers? Are there ways of reducing barriers aside from becoming monocultural, as one politician recently suggested? How can our society benefit from the rich diversity that multiculturalism brings and build social cohesion and community at the same time? How do we do that? And finally, are there barriers at MCC Brisbane that we need to think about? How do we discern what those barriers are? And how do we decide what to do about them? How do we balance a culture of safeguarding with a culture of welcome? Our church has gotten to a size where it's really difficult to know everyone. Not everyone comes every week, and new people come often. And that means instead of sitting around one big table at supper, we sit around multiple tables. We can't have one conversation where everyone sits around and contributes to it. Smaller groups form within our larger church. And those smaller groups tend to coalesce around friendship groups, sometimes age groups, or common interests, or life situations. And those small groups provide belonging and community in a way that the larger group can't. So, is that okay? How do we encourage strong relationships and community and belonging and support in ways that don't become closed off to others? Are there ways of appreciating and learning from our diverse ethnic cultures within our congregation instead of stopping at merely accommodating minority cultures within our dominant culture? I feel encouraged that I can tell newcomers that I meet, you know, if you just pull up a chair at one of the tables out there, chances are pretty high that people around that table will welcome you. That's an encouraging thing, I think. I wonder if one of the ways that we can answer these questions, again, I don't have answers to questions, but I wonder if we could listen more to people who are different from us and maybe hold off on our opinions until we've listened more. I wonder what it would look like to be honest about the differences that we have and the difficulties that sometimes come from those differences instead of pretending the differences don't exist. And I wonder if it is true, and this maybe I'm a little more confident about. Can we believe that answers are found in the collective wisdom of our diversity? I'm going to leave you to think about those hard questions.